Welcome back to another episode of Cold Red. I'm Ray Carr, and with me always is Fitz. Fitz, how are you?
Hi, Ray. Good to be with you.
This season here at Cold Red, we've been dedicating an entire season to a case that both Fitz and I had the opportunity to work when we were at the FBI. It's the Center City Rapist case. And we've had some very interesting guests who have been directly involved in the case and its aftermath. Today, Fitz and I would like to welcome back Sylvester Schieber, the father of Shannon Schieber, who's going to help us in discussing the Center City Rapist case. Usually Chuck Boyle is also with us, but Chuck is recovering from some surgery and is not able to be here with us tonight. Also, we have an amazing guest who has agreed to join us last minute as we take a closer look at this case. Sergeant Kim Cochran. Kim is a detective with the Fort Collins Police Department who in just a few weeks is going to be retiring after a 30-plus year career. Kim, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on as a guest, and congratulations on quite a career in law enforcement.
Thank you, Ray. I appreciate that.
Kim, even in this season, when we bring some law enforcement folks on, can you give us a few minutes, like sort of a background of what was Fort Collins like in the 90s? When exactly did you join? And just walk us a little bit through your career. Then we're going to come, of course, to a pivotal point when you got involved in what we call the Center City Rapist case, and you have maybe some other name for it. But we're going to talk about, of course, when Troy Graves was eventually arrested. But walk us a little bit through what even made you want to become a police officer, any influences in your family? Our audience, a lot of women out there, they like to know, especially with the women law enforcement people we bring on.
Sure. Well, I started really being interested in law enforcement probably in college. My brother was a police officer in Florida, and that piqued my interest a bit as I heard him talking about what a career in law enforcement might look like. And then I had an opportunity when I went to college to become a student officer, is what they called them at the time. I was a student at Colorado State University. And basically it was a position where you had an opportunity to be a police officer. They put you through the training, and it was almost like part-time but full-time police work while you're going to school. So I had an opportunity to do that, and then joined Fort Collins Police Services in 1994, spent a few years on patrol, and in 1999 I became a crimes against persons detective, and was in crimes against persons until probably 2008 or 9. And then I went back to patrol. Then I was in hiring and training for a while. And then I promoted to sergeant. And as a sergeant, I started our forensic services unit and had a forensic services team that processed crime scenes and did cell phone and computer analysis. And then I went back to the street as a sergeant, and my current assignment for the last about 4 years is as the sergeant in internal affairs. So that's a snapshot of my career. As far as Fort Collins, taking you back to the early 90s when I started here, we're looking at, maybe the mid 90s, even later 90s, our population was probably maybe 120,000. And again, as I mentioned, I was a student at Colorado State University. So it's a college town, home to Colorado State University, and some pretty significant tech industry. We had one of the larger companies, a variety of them actually, because we had Woodward Governor here, we had Intel here, we had Hewlett Packard here, we had Kodak in Windsor, which is close by to us. So a pretty wide variety of organizations, big organizations in kind of a smaller community. So that hasn't changed much. Now we're home to, I think we're the capital of microbrews in the country. So we have a number of big microbreweries here. And so even though it's a smaller community now, we're probably more like 175,000. It's got kind of a smaller college town feel as it did then. And I think we've done a pretty good job of maintaining that. But we're now about the fifth biggest, maybe even the fourth in the state of Colorado. So that kind of gives you some 30,000 foot view of the community and our agency.
I think you said it was 99 or so. You were promoted or transferred to crimes against persons squad or unit. Describe what that was like, because that's eventually where we're going with our discussion today. But what was that like? What kind of crimes against persons are we talking?
So in 1999, I was selected for, it was a detective position. It's a lateral transfer for us here. Because of the size of our agency, detectives are not a promotional position. So you literally could go from, being a patrol officer to being a detective, and then at some point you would potentially go back to being a patrol officer. And the appeal for that for us is you get some folks out on patrol who have some really good, investigative experience, which allows us to have first responders that can work kind of hand in hand and know already when they're responding to cases what it is a detective is going to need, because they might have already been a detective, or at least may be responding on some calls to help their teammates also have that perspective. So in 1999, when I became a detective, I joined Crimes Against Persons, which basically for us is a unit that handles almost exclusively sex assaults and crimes against children. We also handled officer-involved shootings and homicides. And although all of those are serious crimes, we did not have, given the size of our community, a large number of homicides or officer-involved shootings. So although we did investigate those, that was more a, once or twice a year event for us, as opposed to the crimes against children, which was mostly a daily event. And other sex crimes, as far as sexual assaults, as I said, it's a college town. So, primarily handling cases involving children and primarily young women victims from in a college environment who had found themselves being victimized in a variety of settings, but almost always by someone that they knew or were acquainted with, as we know nationally is the case.
Kim, we're going to morph into the serial rapist case, and I think this question applies to that, but you were probably trained by some older male officers and detectives, right? But
Sure.
now, obviously, you're a woman. Did you think you took anything different with you to your taskings in dealing with children, of course, but other women
Sure.
who are victim of sexual offenses? How do you think that was different from some of your male colleagues who maybe were doing their best, but maybe you had a different sort of intuition that perhaps they didn't?
Well, I think we all bring something unique to the table, right? With our past experiences, whether that's where we come from, the size of the community we grew up in, your formal education, your life experiences. And so I think that there is certainly a piece of that where men and women see things a bit differently. We see that in a lot of different ways. Anybody who's, been married knows that men and women often see things a little bit differently. But I will say my Crimes Against Persons team was, there was only 6 of us at the time, and we were handling all the crimes of against persons. And when I first went into the unit, I was the only female. So I was working in a team of male detectives. And honestly, they brought a lot to the table as well in terms of the perspective. I felt like it really balanced each other well. For example, at the time, I didn't have children. And so I had a little bit different perspective than some of my male counterparts. Although they were male, they were also parents or husbands. And so, yes, I do think there's something there. I do think that there certainly is a relatability that I had. I think that might be where you're going as far as my ability to relate is probably less of a leap for me as to what it might be like to be in the shoes of our victims as it would be for my male counterparts. So yes, I think there is a relatability piece there and maybe a comfort. I mean, I thought the detectives were amazing. My partners were amazing at building rapport and developing relationships. And I think in some ways that's a good thing. Having somebody who's had a really negative experience with a male because they've been victimized. And again, I'm painting with a broad brush because not all victims are females and not all suspects are males, but the ability to relate to our victims, I think they did an exceptional job. And so, the idea of, yes, there is probably some ability to relate a little bit differently, but, we all have the same, even though we come from different experiences, we have the same training, and so I think that when you take all of those things together, that everybody brings something different to the table, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And yes, being a female probably did give me some ability to relate in a slightly different way.
Well, some of our victims, certainly from Fort Collins, have told us exactly that. And this is a good segue, and I want to bring Syl and Ray in. But just let's get right into it. You're at your desk one day, or you get a phone call at home. Tell us one day the first rape of which you're aware of. Of course, we're talking about Troy Graves. Tell us what happened, and we're not going to use the names of the victims necessarily, maybe 1, 2, 3, and 4, but just walk us through your first involvement with this, and take the listeners to all that you've done back then.
Okay, so just to provide some context, a sexual assault in Fort Collins by somebody who was a complete stranger to the victim was, and still is, frankly, an extremely rare event. In my almost 32 years, I know of only one other series of sexual assaults that we've investigated here involving an unknown suspect. And that actually was before this. It was not after. So this is the last series of sexual assaults. Now, we've had a couple of other series, but they were series where the perpetrators had identified their victims by, maybe a dating app or something. So there was some known component as opposed to coming in through unlocked windows. So this is the last time we actually, 24 years ago, in the last 24 years, we still haven't had a case where somebody came into somebody's residence as a complete unknown stranger and assaulted them. So, to give you some context, this was an extremely rare thing. And in the first case, it actually was fielded initially by a detective who wasn't in our Crimes Against Persons unit, because it went to the detective who was on call. And he was a property crimes detective. And I remember the first I really heard about this was probably a few days after the event happened. And he, sought out a Crimes Against Persons sergeant to basically bounce it off of him and say, hey, this is what I've got. These are the steps that I've taken, collecting the evidence and working on doing a submission to our forensic lab, those kinds of things. And so he was working on that as an individual case at that point in time. And it wasn't until we had a second case, and I happened to be on call and was the detective who happened to catch that case, for lack of a better way of explaining it. And, by then now we have this situation where there's two cases, and there's a lot of similarities, but, I think in almost anything in life, I don't know that we would call two a pattern, right? I mean, typically we expect at least a pattern of something to be at least something of three. So really, I'm going to fast forward, because for me, the place that this really bowls me over and is a moment I'll never forget as long as I live, is the moment that I get the call that we've had a third. Because at that moment in time, I knew exactly what we were about to undertake and the potential implications of what that might look like for our community, for our agency, for young women in our community, for the victims that had already been victimized. I, in an instant, almost had just an overwhelming awareness of what that was now going to look like. But it really didn't come into clarity until we had the third case.
Could you give us a time frame between number 1, number 3, approximately,
Sure.
and also geography?
Sure. So our first case was on May 10th of 2001, and the second case followed about a month later. It was on June 13th of 2001. As far as geography, I think it's significant because the first two cases happened in the same apartment complex. So literally in a college town where we have many apartment complexes and other high density housing areas. Both cases happened in the same apartment complex. And then just 10 days later, because it was June 24th, from June 13th to June 24th, we have the third case. And so really the time frame for the three cases is from May 10th to June 24th. But really between the two. And going to that third case, it was nowhere close to where the first two took place. The first two were much closer to the university, probably about a mile away from the university, whereas the third case was quite a bit further south and east, probably at least 4 maybe or more miles from where the university, the heart of the university. So, and yes, there was some high density housing in that part of town at that time, but not nearly as much. I mean, the high density housing was really concentrated around the CSU campus. And so there was something pretty unique at that stage about the third case, just because of the distance between where the cases took place.
But you decided fairly quickly that the three were related.
For sure. Yes, sir. Almost at the moment I got that phone call, to be honest with you. I mean, as soon as I heard we've had another, there was really no doubt in my mind. And even though we didn't know at case one or case two that it was a series or going to be a series of sexual assaults, because as I said before, I don't think you can draw a pattern off of two events. They were certainly unusual for our community. As I mentioned before, we just did not have cases where somebody was victimized by a complete stranger in their own home, by somebody who entered, in the middle of the night. So although we didn't know that it was going to be a series of sexual assaults at that time, we certainly were working each of those cases as we would any other sexual assault case where, you do all the things, right? You interview the victim and you interview their neighbors and you spread out to a wider canvas and you start, at that time we didn't have the technology that we do now. But, you start trying to figure out, do we have anybody who has surveillance cameras in the area? All the things that you would do to do what I would call good, solid police work.
Kim, you have these sexual investigations that you're working on. How did Fort Collins PD first realize that there may be a connection to the Philadelphia Center City Rapist case?
Mm-hmm. Well, it wasn't until much later, to be honest with you, Ray. We had already, 4, 5. So our fifth attack was on August 5th. And on August 8th, we got our first inquiry from Philly because they had someone in there, either dispatch or maybe whoever collected teletypes for the agency at that time, as I understand it, had seen a national teletype that we had sent out, basically advising other agencies that we were investigating this series of sexual assaults and giving, as much information as we could about the unique identifiers. And I say unique identifiers because at the time I thought they were unique identifiers because I had never investigated a series of sexual assaults. As I mentioned, it's an extremely rare thing. And after we put that teletype out, I found out how actually not unique it really was, because we started to get calls from all over the country. I remember thinking, wow, I had no idea that these kinds of behaviors, and, that's on me. I guess I just did not comprehend that, we have so many at any given time unknown serial sexual assaults going on in this country, which should be shocking and alarming to all of us. I mean, I think that's a piece where we're missing awareness, of course. But I remember we started, as soon as we put that teletype out, I thought, okay, well, maybe somebody will reach out to us. And they just started coming from all over the place, from San Diego, California, to Kearney, Nebraska, to Pittsburgh, all over. where they were investigating cases where some detective had on their caseload a series of sexual assaults, and the things that they, noticed in our message, things like they went in through an unlocked door, they, either blitz attacked the victim or they did something to disguise themselves in a variety of ways. I had no idea that there were that many cases going on. So, initially, to be frank, when the first contact from Philly came in, it was like, well, this is one of many I've received,
Sure.
Probably just that day. I mean, not even to mention in the course since we put the teletype out. But of course, we said, hey, we believe we may have physical evidence. We don't yet know, because when they reached out to us at that first time on August 8th, we still didn't yet know if we had a DNA profile. We started submitting evidence to our state lab pretty much immediately following the first case. And just because, again, of the number of cases, we were competing with other agencies all across the state, in pending cases for homicide trials and, other variety of cases. They were going to a state lab. We didn't have a luxury of having our own lab. So they were going to a state lab, and it took until in September before we had the knowledge that we had a profile here. And shortly thereafter, we had another follow-up conversation. I believe that, to their credit, that the Philly detectives are the ones that reached out, because we said, hey, check back with us when we find out if we are going to have a profile. We believe we will, and we're still awaiting that. And they did follow up later, and we told them that we had an unknown profile and provided them with the information or our contact at the state lab for them to make a connection and for them to then submit their profile to our state lab for a direct comparison. So, and that after, triggered the when we knew there was a connection.
I have to ask this because I think that that you'll probably agree with this, because you said this, that when you got that third phone call, you knew what you were dealing with. So when you look, and I asked, I says, would your investigation rely more heavily on the forensic, like DNA evidence, or on the traditional detective work that you usually do? I mean, I know, being a cop for 35 years, you have a certain sense. You just know you don't need DNA to tell you. Did you get that feeling too?
Just so I'm following you, as far as did I get the feeling without needing DNA to know that those first three cases were connected?
Right.
Well, not just those first three, but even the following ones that, hey, we have somebody that's doing the same thing here. I don't even need DNA to tell me that, but DNA confirms it. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. I mean, there was never a doubt when from the third case forward, every person that reported to us a sexual assault, we knew, because again, going back to, this is such a rarity that I just had no doubt that as soon as we got those calls that we had yet another sexual assault. I did not need DNA to know that they were linked. The similarity was too close. As you said, you have a bit of an intuition, but surely by the fact of the timing, if nothing else, is also an indicator. I mean, as I told you a little bit earlier, in the almost 32 years I've been here, we've had two sexual assault series cases by an unknown suspect. And the one was prior to this. So we have not had one in 24 years. So as suddenly in a month's time, because the fourth case came on July 26th, I mean, it was only like 12 days later. So, that in and of itself is a clue, even if you're not an experienced, trained detective. It's like hitting you upside the head with a 2x4. If we had missed that somehow, we'd be having an entirely different conversation, I think.
Right.
Well, unless you're in Philly PD, and
right.
at a few years before, and I see Syl shaking his head back and forth. He knows this all too well, and Chuck would agree with us if he was here. Retired Philly detective Chuck Boyle. So, and that was a good question, Ray. Yeah, and I've been a street cop, and of course we've both been street agents, Ray. And there are times that you say, you know what? I may want the DNA for court purposes, or I may want the fingerprints for court purposes, but there's enough behavioral evidence, there's enough MO, modus operandi, and signature behavior. And Ray and I learned that later when we studied to be profilers, that said, yeah, this is the same person. That was pretty clear to Fort Collins PD. It was not clear to the bosses in the Philly PD, and we're not saying anything today that hasn't been said before. Granted, smaller PD, much larger PD, we acknowledge that up front, but there are also some political ramifications. So Kim, internally to the PD, you realized similarities, probably a pattern, probably the same person. Externally, you put the teletype out, routine procedure in many cases, but you got to follow up on that. How about, so that's the micro version. The macro version. Was the media, was the public notified by second, third, fourth rape that there's something going on here?
Yeah, we actually started reaching out more locally. And when I say that, I mean within the apartment complex where the first two cases happened, while we were still investigating the first two cases, because they were in the same complex. So one might even think maybe this is a neighbor of those two women because of the geography of where they are. I can tell you after the third case, our investigation became kind of two-pronged. And when I say two-pronged, I mean, the difference I think between us and Philly is Philly had a case that was now cold, right? And we had cases that were actually happening at the time. So we had to be doing both investigating and notifying. I mean, and in equal parts, frankly, because we needed to make sure that to the best of our ability, we identified this perpetrator as quickly as possible. And we were doing everything we could to try to make sure that we didn't have women who were vulnerable and exposed at the same time. And so I think one of the challenges of this investigation is that we were trying to not just investigate. It wasn't just a matter of, collecting evidence and doing canvases and trying to run down, as tips started coming in, trying to manage literally hundreds of tips while at the same time trying to make sure that we are being as proactive as we can to protect the young women in our community. And again, looking back in hindsight, we're talking about in 2001, we didn't have social media. There was no way to easily notify the community that this was going on. So what that looked like was us trying to hand walk flyers to apartment complexes and have them taping them to the mailboxes and meeting with apartment complex managers to ask them to, put notices on each individual resident's door. And, we have a local newspaper here. So when these events were happening, obviously this was an above the fold story every day, especially on days when we had an event happen. But even on days that we didn't, there was, that was the primary method for the public becoming aware, at least the broader public, right? Because the more consolidated public were the folks that we felt like were at greatest risk, right? College students, because these were all college students age women for the most part. And also people who lived in high density housing. I mean, that's where our cases were happening. So our focus was really trying to, in addition to having a segment of our team doing investigative work, we also had folks who were trying to make sure we were getting ahead as much as possible. And so it felt like it was a bifurcated process, which I think was a little bit different, at least at this stage, because the Philly cases were now behind them. So their piece was at this stage, once the connection was made, their piece was to just run down new leads that might have come up. And ours still continue to be, we have this individual here, so we have to continue to do both.
My recollection is we were contacted after Graves was caught by a professor from Colorado State University. Her maiden name actually happened to be Schieber. And she told us that when the attacks, I don't know how far along, but on at least one or more occasions, almost immediately after an attack became known, students were being notified completely across the campus almost instantaneously by email of the attacks going on. So it was a much different situation in terms of informing the community than what was going on out east.
Oh, absolutely. So there was such a big difference in how it was handled in Fort Collins versus how it was handled in Philly. I want to ask you, Kim, and I think there was a ball cap that was left at one of the
Yeah.
crime scenes. Can you walk us through how that helped contribute in advancing your investigation?
Well, I can tell you how it came about. I don't know that I would say that it advanced our investigation, to be honest with you. And I'll tell you why. So the way that came about is following the, I guess it was the sixth attack. It was the one where we had 2 young women in the apartment. That was a first. Following that, they found a Quicksilver baseball cap at the apartment when they were processing the scene. It seemed out of place to have a baseball cap like that in the apartment of these 2 young women. So when we were processing the sign, we were in constant communication with our victims, of course. And so we checked with them to make sure it didn't belong to them or, anyone that they had invited over. And it turned out that it could not be accounted for. So we had a very strong reason to believe that it belonged to our suspect. So in the good way, we now have, okay, well, this is a baseball cap. And for those of you who've done a lot of police work, a baseball cap is a really good source of DNA, right? So we know that there's very likely a DNA source there. So that's a good thing. And we have this piece that we can now publish to the public, which we did, right? Like I have pictures of this baseball cap that we started, again, now including in the information that we were putting out to the public. The reason I say I'm not sure that it was a blessing per se is it started generating a lot of tips from people who have seen somebody wearing a baseball cap that has the Quicksilver logo on it. Well, I wasn't the most hip individual, I'm going to say. In that stage of my life, I was, very much involved in my career and not so much in whatever the popular line of surfer clothing was. And so I had to ask around a bit to even find out what this Quicksilver brand was all about. And so, I guess the point is that putting that information out, which we did immediately, of course, because we wanted to develop leads. I don't know that it helped us because suddenly now we're getting calls from people who know somebody who happens to be a 20 to 30-year-old male who smokes, because those were some of the things that we knew, who wears this brand of hat. Well, that just generates a lot of information, and it's not particularly useful. And there were several times in this investigation where, honestly, it felt like what we were struggling with was not a lack of information. It was a plethora, just an overload of information. And that can be its own problem because the more information that you start to get, and now you have to try to filter through that and figure out what's critical, what's useful, and what do we run with when there are so many avenues to pursue that it becomes just you can get literally buried in the amount of information that you have and trying to figure out how to prioritize that.
With all that information that you have, and you have probably a large pool of suspects, how were you able to narrow that suspect pool that eventually led you to Troy Graves?
Well, you're right. It did lead. We did have a lot of suspects. I think towards the end, we were up to 900 and some identified named suspects, which is, as you can imagine, I've just described to you, we have 6 crimes against persons detectives, and we've, brought in a number of other resources from inside the agency to help us. But to try and run down those leads is extremely time consuming. So really kind of the strategy that we employed before our connection with Philadelphia was to try to, do as much workup as we can on each of these named individuals, and then basically invite them in and ask them a series of questions that we had designed to have it be kind of a standard questionnaire to see if we could start eliminating people, whether it's can you provide an alibi for any of these dates of these attacks? Do you smoke? Some things like that we could concretely identify, because, we couldn't submit a DNA profile or a DNA sample to CBI to have them test all 900 people. It just was an unrealistic expectation. So we had to try to bring people in as they started to rise to the top. They met some of these check boxes for us. So we would invite them in. Certainly if they didn't show up, they suddenly became very high on the top of the list, because now we were going out and seeking a court order to get their DNA, right? A no-show suddenly moved you up the list pretty quickly, right? So the ones that were showing up, we were collecting DNA samples, asking them questions, and then, on an almost daily basis, we would meet after we would have whomever the dozen or so people were that we could tackle in a day, after we had a chance to talk about them and what they had to say and if we could eliminate them. Then we'd pick, the ones that we could to submit to CBI to have them test their DNA, because we couldn't eliminate them in any other way. And then we would move on, rinse and repeat. Really, the place that this changes is when we do make the connection with Philadelphia, because now we have something that we can actually look at. Your DNA profile is not like the scarlet letter, on your chest. So it doesn't help us much, honestly, to have a DNA profile until we have a suspect. In fact, it does really nothing for us other than to connect our case with Philadelphia. But having DNA did nothing for us. So until we get that connection, right? And then having that connection, you think, okay, well, this case is as good as solved, right? Because how many people could there be that have a connection where they're in Philadelphia in the mid to late 90s, and now they're in Fort Collins, Colorado in 2001? Well, I would have thought it would have been a handful, and I can tell you that it wasn't. I can tell you that I think one of the first lists we got, and we later got another list from Philly. They were great about being able to provide us with some information like that. But I think the first list we got had like 320 people on it, and who'd have thought that? Even that, you're thinking, oh, I'm going to have 5 people I can go track down. Well, it wasn't 5. It was like 300 and some. And so then you have to try and filter. Okay, great. Well, we have these 300 people. Now trying to find ways to just, constantly sifting the information, I guess. And we can't just stop doing other things, right? I mean, that's one of the avenues. But, we're getting things like, okay, well, I'm gonna divert a little bit, because what tended to happen, and this was just timing, I think, was we'd get something like this. Like, for example, we get this connection with Philadelphia, and great, but it happens on September the 12th. Well, on September the 11th, our whole world changed, right? We couldn't even get the Philadelphia detectives here because the airports were closed. Mm-hmm. So, there would be this, we feel like we're starting to get momentum and we're going somewhere, right? And we'd maybe in this process that I described to you before, we'd have a suspect that would start to look really good. They didn't have an alibi and they smoke and they match the physical description and all the things, right? And so then we collect DNA from them and we wait, and then we get a result back that it's not them, right? And so you go from, oh, we're on this hot track to now we just start over, right? We're back at square one. And simultaneously, more cases are still happening, right? So not only are we trying to run down leads as they're happening from the earlier cases, but now we've got cases that are still happening. And so, when you get that DNA connection to Philadelphia, I think we finally were able to connect with them on the 15th, I think, of September. They were able to get here. And we had a chance to meet face to face. And so, that really kind of started to help us develop, some relationship and to try and figure out how we could do this. But again, the connection with Philly, it was very critical. I cannot tell you enough. I feel like we had Troy Graves ultimately identified through some other sources. But it would have taken us a while longer to get through all of our suspects. When there's 900 suspects, yes, he was one of them, but it would have taken us a lot longer to work through every one of those. And I can tell you without a doubt in my mind, we would have worked through every one of them. If it took until this point in my career, we would have kept working until we found out or eliminated every single one of them. But what Philly brought for us was a chance to now give a filter that we actually had an immediate identifying factor, right? And so then we could start prioritizing our suspects that they had to have that connection, right? Up to that, we didn't have something that was like a must, but that was the first must. And so I think that really helped us to then pare down the number of suspects and really work as a team. For example, none of our victims had the ability to provide us with a composite drawing because none of them saw the suspect. They might have gotten a slight glimpse. We knew that he was probably either a dark complected white male or a light complected black male, but that was about it. We knew he probably smoked because of an odor, right? But it wasn't until we made the connection with Philly and they were able to provide us with a composite drawing that we could now even get that out into our community. So our flyers prior to our connection with Philly just had words. Like it was just, we're looking for a description. Well, that description unfortunately fit a fairly high number of people, which doesn't really get you anywhere. So I feel like what really turned the corner for us was the Philly connection. But as I started to say earlier, just when something like that happens, so we get that Philly connection, or we get a tip that we're following, and then something comes up, like we get a letter in the mail from the suspect, right? And so now all the things you are going, today's my plan, I'm going to go contact XYZ suspects, right? And that's our plan, and we're working through filtering our suspects and doing that. When all of a sudden today the admin assistant brings to me my desk a letter, and when I open it, it's from Troy Graves. I mean, okay, well now we're going to have to go in a completely different direction because we have a communication from the suspect, right? And how often does that happen? So now you have to just kind of put everything else that you've done up to this point on pause, or not, right? Frankly, you can't, because you still need to continue to pursue all of those other things. And you have this whole new avenue of information, which takes back to the overload.
One other question. In the fall of 2001, there was a murder that occurred that for a small group of detectives working on cases involving murder, plus all the sexual assaults, plus the kid assaults, plus whatever else flew in the door. This was a pretty big distraction also for you, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And I really appreciate your recognizing that, Mr. Schieber, because a lot of people might not see how that would tax, an agency of our size. And to have recognition and appreciation for the challenge that did present to us. And it was a challenge because our task force then basically became me. I was the only person really left at that stage who was still mostly full-time, actively working this case. But because of all our detectives, and Mr. Edward Hernandez was murdered. He was an 82-year-old man who was beaten to death in his apartment. And it was also an unknown suspect, which, again, I've told you, these things in Fort Collins just don't happen. So for us to have now a series of sex assaults being committed by an unknown suspect and now a homicide by an unknown suspect, we had no reason to believe they were in any way related, of course. But obviously, they're both very taxing. And for a smaller community, now we've got the community in an even higher sense of awareness and concern. It's heightened, if it could be, even more. And so you're right, that did pose another hurdle for us to overcome while trying to stay on the course of doing these other things. I think as you start to look at it, not in a vacuum, in hindsight, we can say, okay, here's when we got his name. And if we just follow this very direct line back to the cases in Philadelphia, I can, in hindsight, see it plain as day, right? Like, here's his name, and it like on a slingshot, right? Too, right? Knowing who he is. But when I when I look at it outside of that vacuum with, as what you've just described, we have this, now there's another case, or there's some other thing that's come up, to try to navigate that in that very much winding road that it was at the time. It's very hard in retrospect to just really understand just how overwhelming that is when you're right in the middle of it, and all these things are going on simultaneously.
Not to criticize, but to put this in context. After Shannon was murdered, Philly Homicide put together a task force of 10 detectives, and those 10 detectives, but between them, were working this case, the Shannon murder case, 24/7 for several months, just focused on this case. So to put, there have been people that have been critical of that things didn't get done as quickly as possible in Fort Collins. I'm very sympathetic to what was going on in Fort Collins, and everything I've seen is there was a very different level of diligence applied to the investigation of what was going on there than had been applied to what happened, what was going on in Philadelphia in the 1997 and early 1998 years.
I thank you, sir. I really do. I feel so connected to you for your loss and for how that brought us to meet each other. And I can't even in my wildest imagination understand what that has been like for you and your wife and your family. And so, to have you recognize that and give us grace, it means more than you can know.
Well, we appreciate your efforts.
Thank you, sir.
Kim, can we go back to the letter? Was it signed by Troy Graves or was it anonymous?
Not as Troy Graves.
It was not signed by Troy Graves. It was a typed letter that had a lot of rambling. There was no punctuation, and it was entirely in small letters with no punctuation. And really, what I would describe it as was his attempt to throw us off track. He gave us a number of little tidbits that, of course, we would have to follow up, right? Like, you can't not follow up if they give you pieces of information. For example, one of the things he said was he made some comment about Temple, going to school at Temple. And, it was already a consideration we had. Could this be somebody who was, a student in Fort CSU and a student, in the Philadelphia area? Well, then he throws out Temple. Well, now you can imagine we've had to reach out to Temple and get their student list and try and figure out if there are any students at Fort Collins and students that were at Temple. So it created some more things for us to run down. In terms of his signature, he didn't sign it with his name, but he provided information in that letter about some of the circumstances of the victims. Specifically, he talked about, that they had cats or what he had done when he was in the apartment, that were pieces of information that nobody outside of our police department knew. And probably the vast majority of people, even inside our police department, didn't know. So there was no doubt, again, when I read that letter, like you talked about earlier, your instinct. There wasn't even a nanosecond where I thought, oh, this is just some, person trying to insert themselves into the investigation. Although we did have a few of those along the way, as every, high profile case does. But I knew instantly that it was from him. And we later got confirmation because he licked the envelope. So we had DNA on the envelope. So, he doesn't sign it.
But he did
and he
mail
gives
it
us.
from Denver. But he did
I'm
mail
sorry?
it. He did mail it from Denver.
Well, it's interesting because it did have a Denver postmark, which is really interesting because that was another thing to run down, right? And now I can tell you that actually even the mail that you mail in Fort Collins at that time, they put on a truck, they sent it to Denver where they stamped it. and then they shipped it back up here for delivery. And so even at that time, the postmark didn't mean anything to us because we didn't know where it was actually mailed from. It could have been mailed from Fort Collins, or it could have, as you said, sir, been mailed from Denver.
One other piece of information that you probably don't even know. He was an avid reader. We actually have received a couple letters from him. He's quite articulate. He knows punctuation. He knows grammar. I mean, it was clearly an effort to throw you off.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I did not know that he had communicated with you, so thank you for sharing that.
We, in my profiling days and fledgling forensic linguist days, after the Unabomb case, I realized a number of criminals around the country were doing exactly what Troy Graves did. They know they're suspects in a case, and they write these anonymous letters trying to, and I knew the guy didn't sign it, but I just didn't know whether he had a fake name or a pseudonym, and they try to make it look like someone else committed the crime. And I actually came up with a name. It's so many syllables, I had to give it an acronym: post-offense manipulation of investigation communication, POMIC for short. I published on it. Other linguists have picked up on that term. So, and there's another good. The John Benet Ramsey letter may be a POMIC written by someone just to throw off the investigation. So, and that's also Colorado, of course. No connection between the two, we know. So anyway, it's very interesting that letter came in when he knew he was a suspect and his time was limited. So at some point, he's called into the office. Do you have the initial sit down with him, asking these questions, getting DNA? You're sitting across the desk at some point. How does that go?
So by the time that we contacted him, he had risen to the top of our list. Just probably a couple days before he was called in, I had been able to get some additional detectives back on the case because we recognized that spring was here and there was a good chance that this dormant individual might start to offend again. So we kind of started to ramp up things again, and I got some additional detectives assigned. And I remember, I think it was about April 19th, I assigned a detective to a group of what we called Priority 1 suspects, which would be people who had that Philly connection that we hadn't been able to otherwise eliminate. And I asked him to investigate Troy Graves first because we had had some communications with Philly, and they had, in these back and forth communications, we had tried to work together to identify who might be our best suspects as they were trying to run leads there and we were running leads here. And so I asked them to try and to track him down. And they started with doing it. We did literally hundreds of times before, just reaching out and, requesting somebody to call in. And so while that was in the works, we got some additional information because Philadelphia continued to work on him as a suspect. And they received some information about him possibly being involved in some unusual, maybe concerning types of behaviors. I didn't know what those were at the time, but that there might be something there. There also was a possibility they learned of his blood type, but we didn't have a blood type. So we had to try and figure out some of those things, like how do we turn this into something? But fast forward, what ends up happening is we identify that he's very high on the list. His wife called back to the detective who left a card behind and said he's at work. He's up at the military base up at F.E. Warren today at a dentist appointment. But I think we can come in this evening when he gets home from his assignment there. And so we coordinated with CID on the base there and made sure that he was under surveillance while he was on the base until we could get him back here to Fort Collins, because we were starting to feel like he had risen to such a level that we didn't want to risk it. So while that was in process, we had people here in Fort Collins ready to intercept him at the state line as he was driving back to town to keep kind of a loose tail on him. Because at this point, again, we don't have his DNA. We don't have his fingerprints. We have nothing. If he doesn't show up at that moment, we don't actually have enough to get probable cause to arrest him. So we really needed him to come to the station voluntarily so we could start to have a conversation. And while he's having that conversation, I already had written a 411 warrant to get his controls, because I knew from our fifth case that we had a fingerprint. That was the one thing we did have. But we didn't have enough to, at that moment, compel him to provide fingerprints even, or compel him to provide DNA. So we really needed to kind of try and keep it as low key as we could to, help him understand we were doing this for anybody who had a connection to Philly. And it wasn't because he was a specific suspect, but just this was the process we were going through. And if he could come in and help us out, that would be great. And, we told the same thing to his wife. So I'm sure had he, told her he wasn't going, he would have recognized that probably would have made her a bit more suspicious, right? We learned later that she probably already had at least some suspicion, even though I don't think she ever truly had any knowledge. I think she thought there was some peculiarities. But we get him here, and while the detective is doing a fantastic job gathering information and, kind of helping us to see some of these red flags as he's talking, I was able to get a warrant signed for the 411 or for the non-testimonial evidence. And we were able to then roll his fingerprints, and immediately, once we had a fingerprint, we had an analyst standing by to do a comparison. And they knew immediately when they rolled the print. They had compared so many prints, because we literally sent that unknown fingerprint to every state in the United States and asked them to compare it to whatever they had in their database, because there isn't a national database for fingerprints unless somebody has been involved in a crime. And stuff, a lot of those don't go into a national database. They're in state databases. So we had to send them out. And so all those were coming back in, and our analysts were asking people to take pictures and, doing comparisons to other unknown suspects that they had. So there was a lot of analysis that was going on. So as soon as our latent fingerprint analyst rolled the print, she knew it was him. I mean, she had looked at so many prints, and, when you have that degree of expertise and you know exactly what you're looking for, she knew instantly it was him. Nonetheless, we did take him to the hospital and do a blood draw to get DNA, and brought him back here and continued to interview him. And then at some point, once we were able to get all the things that we needed to line up, we got those lined up. Then ultimately we told him he was in custody and he wasn't going to be leaving here. So, but there, as I said, again, there's a lot of moving parts all along the way for these things, right? Because one of the things that we were committed to doing from the very beginning was to make sure that whenever we had something of significance in our case, that none of our victims read it in the newspaper or heard it on a news broadcast or heard it from their friend or any other way. And it would be harder, honestly, for us to do that now with the way social media is, because somebody would tweet or put on Facebook or whatever information. But at the time, they really were lagging in getting information. At least we had a few hours till a news article or probably a TV news show would air to get to them. And our commitment was to always get to them, to tell them when we had either a new case or we had some significant development. And certainly once we had a suspect identified, that will be probably a memory I'll carry with me forever, is being able to, share with these young women and with the Schiebers that we had a suspect and he was in custody.
Let me ask you this question. Once you identified him to his prints and then the DNA, you knew beforehand that it was probably him, but you just confirmed it, and then you were able to tell him, Mr. Graves, you're not going to be leaving, you're in custody. What was his reaction?
Really none. I mean, there was he was very low key throughout this whole entire process. When we first asked him for a sample, he, again, of his fingerprints or his blood, he didn't refuse necessarily. He just, kind of tried to delay it, like, hey, I'm going to need to think about that. I guess he probably thought if he kept it fairly low key and said, well, I'll come back or whatever, that he was going to leave here and then be able to probably flee. But that wasn't the way at all we had it planned. So when we finally said, you're not leaving, I think by that time he pretty well knew, like, it was over. There wasn't anything dramatic, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. His demeanor throughout his contact with us was, very, very low key. I mean, just not at all. He was surprisingly soft spoken. As Mr. Schieber has alluded to, I believe he probably is pretty intelligent. He was fairly well spoken and fairly soft spoken. So, there were times as having interaction that you just have to remind yourself, like, this is a guy who is a Jekyll and Hyde, right? There's two very distinct individuals residing in this one body, because the person who's right here in front of us now, that's polite and soft-spoken and reserved and can carry on intelligent conversation, is not the person that was in the apartment with any of these young women. And you just kind of had to remind yourself, because it's so unbelievable.
That's exactly the way his attorney, I believe her name is Catherine Hay, described him to us as we were talking to her about it. Literally Jekyll and Hyde. Mm-hmm. Question: what was his wife's reaction?
She was. It's hard. I can't even imagine what it'd be like to find yourself in that position. She was appropriately surprised, of course, and yet I think there were some indicators all along. But again, all of us, denial is a very powerful thing. Right. Even, when you're sitting across the table from him I know he's the guy because we've had his fingerprints, right? And, we have his fingerprints. I know it's him. There's no doubt it's anybody else. And yet here's this guy who is like any other guy that just is an ordinary guy, or seems to be, right? So I just, shock, I guess, would be a one-word description.
But see, they're the ones that can be more successful. They have this personality that they can basically code switch, not just their language, but their entire persona and demeanor, and they don't get high on the suspect list until you have something like DNA or fingerprints. So, yeah, it takes nothing away from you or anyone in this chat about how he could have fooled a lot of people, including probably his wife. So no surprise there in terms of the ones that are rough and can control themselves, yelling and screaming. Of course, they're going to be considered suspects much sooner than someone like Troy Graves, who apparently could turn that switch off when he had to.
I have to ask, Kim, how did you and your team manage the emotional toll with such a prolonged, serious case? How did you guys handle it? I mean, it's not like you just have one victim. You have multiple victims, and you're juggling all these cases and all these victims and these emotions, and you have these emotions that are going through. And it's not like this is something that happens all the time to you guys. This is something that's a rarity in your area. How did you guys deal with that?
We were blessed to have a lot of support from our agency and from our community. And we have a long-standing history of a really good relationship with our community. So, we felt like even though there was a press for us to solve this case, right, of course, by both, the city, the agency, the public, there was also a lot of support and understanding. So we felt supported. I think that was a big piece of it. It wasn't adversarial. It was, there was not some undue stress for other reasons, going on. As far as like, I know that in some of these cases, like unfortunately Mr. Schieber's experience, there's, some conflict or some other, things that create additional stress and difficulties and, internal politics and all those things. We were really blessed to have a lot of internal and external support. So, especially from the agency, the community, and frankly, our family. We were lucky to have that as well. Very understanding. All the people on the team had spouses that were extremely understanding of the amount of time and distraction for pretty much a year that we just checked out, of our lives. But, I guess the thing that it brings me back to is, yes, there were challenges, and yes, it was at times emotionally draining. And the really important thing is that we all had the same goal. I mean, our focus was 100% all the time on the fact that we have to find this guy, because he has literally taken away a young woman's life, and he has altered the life of so many others, both victims and those who, in their families, and the families of, of every victim was impacted by this. So really, I think a lot of it was just about the keeping our focus on doing the work as best we could, and trying to make sure that we were taking care of the people who needed us the most, the victims of our cases. And I didn't have any direct contact with the victims in Philadelphia other than the Schiebers. So just being mindful that was our purpose for that year, was to make sure that their needs were met. I mean, really trying to just put whatever they needed to the forefront. And I guess you would call that a separation. You kind of wall off, or you put it in a box, or, whatever it takes to, I guess, not deal with it in that moment, because really it's not about me. It's not about what I need at that time. It's about what our victims and their families needed.
Your comment on community support is interesting. Fort Collins Police has a long history of a community oversight board. Was that part of the direct interaction with the community that kept the community abreast of what you were doing? And
no, we do have a citizen review board, and by charter, it's a group of citizens who are appointed by city council, and they review certain types of cases, primarily cases involving allegations of police misconduct.
Okay.
So their involvement really is only, it's a fairly narrow focus.
Yeah.
I mean, really, honestly, I think that the reason we have the relationship we do with our community is it's a priority for us. Like, that is a focus for us. It's not just some box we check, or, it isn't by accident. No relationship you have, as anybody knows, you don't have to be in police work. No relationship you have is by accident. If you are going to have a strong relationship of any kind, it takes work, and it takes a commitment, and it takes an intentionality about it. And I think for as long as I've been here, we have had a recognition of that, and an expectation that's who we hire. We hire people who want to have a relationship with their community, and that has served us so well over the years, and it just continues to grow. Frankly, I mean, it was a focus then, and if anything, it's even more of a focus now. I mean, and I think that the importance of that can't be understated. When there's times across the country where there's so much conflict between communities and their law enforcement agencies, having that relationship where, do we always get it 100% right? No, absolutely not. Right. But I think that we have some money in the bank, so to speak. When we have a goof, they can say, hey, yes, that maybe didn't go the way we would have hoped, but there's all this other time, that you have put deposits in, and now you're taking out a little bit of a withdrawal, but there's all these other times that you made deposits. And so when we have something like that, we probably get a little bit of latitude, because there's a relationship there, right? And people recognize, right? You might have a mistake or whatever, but they know us. They know that our intention and our people are about trying to do the right thing for the right reasons. And I believe our community members are the same thing of them, right? I know a lot of people who've been doing this job a really long time leave feeling like it's an us versus them relationship, a very adversarial and negative relationship, because they've been exposed to so many negative things over the years. But as I leave, going full circle with where our conversation has started, as I'm leaving, I don't feel that way at all. I feel like I am extremely grateful to have had the career that I've had and to build those relationships. And that's frankly going to be the thing that I miss the most.
One other question. I have heard that after everything was all over, you brought the women together who had been attacked by Graves, and sat down and had kind of a brainstorming session about what had gone right and what had gone wrong. Was that actually what went on?
To be honest with you, I don't have a specific memory of that. I can tell you that following the cases, we had ongoing communications with them. I think the group setting was inspired by one of the many TV programs that came about. Sure. I won't take credit for that. I don't think that was at our initiative. We did participate, and that's a thing that is also a part of our culture. To be honest with you, I talk about our culture being the relationship with the citizens, but part of our culture is also this expectation that even if we solve a case, it doesn't mean everything went right or that we did everything exactly as we would want to do it the next time. And so one of the parts of our culture as an agency, whether it's a small case where the next day at shift briefing, you're going to basically debrief how that incident went, and you're going to talk about the things that went right and the things that went maybe not so great and the things you do different. We do that on an almost daily basis at shift briefings. So in a case of this magnitude, of course, you look back on it and are there things that we would do differently? Of course. I mean, I think that you're not doing a service that is expected of you from your community if you just say, well, we've got it all figured out and there's nothing for us to learn. And, every time you learn something new, and it might not apply to every case. It might never apply again, but you need to take that away and at least, store it in your toolbox for in the event that you can use it at some point in the future.
But I'll tell you, Kim, the last 10 minutes you would serve as a PSA for the Fort Collins PD for recruiting. You laid it out and spelled it so well, ideally for all of law enforcement, but some agencies are much better dealing with the matters, relationships with communities, et cetera, than others. So words very well spoken there. Your time is valuable. I thank you. Ray, any final words or questions, and then I'll take us out.
No, I just want to let you know, we talked about this before we came on the air, but we have spoken to some of the victims of Fort Collins, and they praised your glory, and they couldn't thank you enough for how they were treated and how the Fort Collins PD handled the case and continue to stay in contact. And they wanted to we told them that you were going to be retiring, and they wanted to say, all of them wanted to say congratulations and thank you. They wanted to say that.
Thank you so much.
They were personally moved by your commitment to investigating their cases and how personally invested you became. They are very grateful for the work you've done.
I thank you for that. I mean, obviously I've had a lot of experiences over these many years, but none of them will be any more impactful than the experiences I had as a part of this case. And I've been inspired over the last 24 years by these young women and just the relationship that we did have during that time. And, just the hope that from that moment in their life that didn't become their whole world, right? Like that's the best I could hope for, is we could make an arrest and, for the Schiebers and for all of the victims here and in Philadelphia, that we could at least give them the knowledge that the person who harmed them was not going to harm them or anyone else ever again. And all I could hope in the years since is that having that allowed them to move forward in the best way possible. So I have nothing but very fond feelings for the young women that we unfortunately met under the most horrible of circumstances.
Sergeant Kim Cochran, Kim, thank you for your time on Cold Red today. More importantly, thank you for your career as a first responder, as a police officer for 32 years. Hard to believe. It looks like you must have started right out of grade school. But best luck to the rest of your life. I know you're going to be busy doing different things, but maybe someday you'll consider coming back on Cold Red. Talk about some of the things in your career or what you're doing in current time. Before we go, I do want to read a public service announcement from our friends at the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. If you or someone you know has experienced sexual assault, you are not alone. RAIN's National Sexual Assault Hotline offers free, confidential, 24/7 support in English and in Espanol. Call 800-656-HOPE or 4673. Chat at hotline.rain.org or text HOPE to 64673. Everyone, please subscribe to Cold Red. Like us. ColdRedPodcast.com is where you can find out more about us. Thanks to Matt Robinson, Matt McLaughlin, our producers, Rick Schilling, our music coordinator. Of course, thanks to Ray, Sil, and of course, Sergeant Kim Cochran, and everyone else. Thanks for listening and or watching. See you next time on Cold Red.